Welcome to the next lecture in the series on North Africa and Southwest Asia. In today's lecture, which will be broken into two parts, we will discuss the physical landscape, population, and history, and then several aspects of the culture of the region, including religions, the human cultural hearth, and oil and petrochemicals. For many, the Middle East is an encompassing term for a region that includes much of North Africa and the gateway to Asia. Physically, the region is dominated by semi-desert and desert areas bordering the Mediterranean Sea in the north, the Red Sea in the east, the Indian Ocean, and its extensions, the Gulf of Aden and the Persian Gulf. In North Africa, there are key physiographic features that include the Atlas Mountains in the west, the Al-Hagar Highlands in the southern Algerian region, and of course the Nile River basin and its delta. Southwest Asia is dominated by the Arabian Peninsula, the Sinai, and the Zagros Mountains. Vast stretches of the region are only marginally habitable. Water in the form of four major river systems, the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, and the Jordan, have long influenced, if not controlled, the people of the region. Please pay attention to four major physiographic regions or subregions within the area that we're studying. That is the Maghreb in the west of Morocco, the Levant, which essentially is the area associated with the Jordanian River Valley, the Anatolia Peninsula in Turkey, and of course Mesopotamia, which is the basin of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Throughout the region, water is a critical resource. In this slide, you can see several ways water and water scarcity is apparent. The image on the left shows irrigated farmland in Saudi Arabia. Here, the people of the region have the wealth to extract groundwater as virtually the sole source of water for farming. Because of the favorable temperature in the region, these systems are very productive and very expensive. The middle image shows the contrast between the productivity of the course of the Nile River and its adjacent deserts. This system has been at work for millennia, and only relatively recently has the construction of the Aswan High Dam for hydroelectricity changed its function. On the right, you see the complexity of water rights issues that overlap with geopolitical issues in the area surrounding the Jordan River. Again, this is an area where conflict over water has been present for millennia. So remember, in studying for the physiographic and physical aspects of North Africa and Southwest Asia, to focus on the water resources and on the four main topographic areas as they relate to the geopolitical areas. Okay, as we move away from the physical geography of North Africa and Southwest Asia, I want to begin by talking about human population and population distributions. A term that you need to know when you look at this is the concept of physiologic density. And what we mean by that is not just the number of people per unit area, but the number of people per unit area of arable or agricultural land. And when you look at that number in terms of density in the area, what we see is that this region has some of the highest physiologic densities on the planet. There's just not a lot of good arable land. It's also important to understand kind of where the important population clusters are. And if you look at the map on this slide, what you're going to see is that there are important clusters in the west. The cluster in the west is known as the Maghreb, of course, and we know also that there is an important cluster in the Nile Delta. What you also see on the map is that there are areas of relatively high population density along the western Mediterranean coast, along the southern tip of the Red Sea and the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, and then in the areas of the northern countries where the climate is a little bit more tolerable and amenable to agriculture. Okay, as we move on from population, we're going to begin to talk about a couple of key cultural components in the cultural landscape excuse me, and cultural geography of the region. First of which is the concept of the Fertile Crescent, and it's important to Western culture. First of all, we understand that approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago, human populations began to form settlements in this region that were permanent or semi-permanent. Along with these permanent settlements was the development of cities and the development of permanent agricultural technologies, most notably the harvesting of cereal grains. And in this slide you can see the distribution of the Fertile Crescent, the important cultures that evolved from it, and then also you can see some of the technology. The development of settlements and of agriculture likely led to the evolution of religious traditions within the region. And from the standpoint of Western culture, North Africa and Southwest Asia is generally understood to be the hearth of monotheism within the region. And remember, monotheism is the concept of a single deity within a theistic or a theological system. So when we're looking here, and it's important, I put two images here that are worth noting. The one on the left is of the Kaaba in Mecca. That is the holiest site for Islam. If you look to the right, what you see is the landscape of Jerusalem, and this slide is a kind of wonderful example of Orthodox architecture, Islamic architecture, Christian architecture, and Judaic architecture. While an understanding of religion in North Africa, South Asia should include discussion of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, for the purposes of this class, I do want to spend a brief amount of time emphasizing components of Islam in order to help students understand it in the broader context of what's going on in the world today. So a couple of key points. Islam was founded by the Prophet Muhammad, who was born in 570 in Mecca. During his lifetime, he was essentially driven out of Mecca, fled to Medina, where the religion was really developed, and in Medina he died in 632. During his lifetime, he presented the canonical work in Islam, that of the Quran, as well as other writings. As you can see from the past slide, the movements of Muhammad between Mecca and Medina, and ultimately a night vision movement to Jerusalem, forms the foundation of the geography of Islam. The cultural components of it are based on what we call the 5 pillars. And as you read the text, make sure that you understand what these 5 pillars are. Briefly, they are the pledge of faith, or the Shahada, 5 ritual prayers that occur every day, charity to the poor, fasting during the Ramadan period, and finally, for all Muslims, when it is possible, a pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. The 5 pillars and the geography of Muhammad's movements form the core of Islam. And what we can see in this slide is that during the early phase of Islam, essentially from its founding in 622 through the peak of the Ottoman Empire, Islam moved throughout much of Africa, some of Europe, and certainly a large portion of South and Central Asia. This greatest expansion was under the Ottoman Empire by about 1450. The expansion of the Islamic empires following the death of Muhammad should also be understood in terms of their overlap and co-occurrence with the expansion of Christianity in the years immediately prior to this and during those years. And what you can see in this slide is that much of the area of North Africa and Southwest Asia had similar co-occurrences, but that Christianity moved much farther into Europe and to the areas adjacent to the Russian and the the Proto-Tsarist empires. Today, much of Western Europe and the Americas are struggling to understand the nature of Islam. Many terms you come across have little or no meaning to the average, excuse me, the average person. A couple of terms that I want you to understand, and make sure you read these in the text. Shia Islam versus Sunni Islam. And again, a brief summary. Shia Islam favors the passing of power within the traditions through Muhammad's family, whereas Sunni Islam favors a passing of power through established clergy. Remember that most Muslims, 2/3 in fact, practice the Sunni form. Also, an important term is the theocratic state, and in Islam, that is, an example would be Iran, where the Ayatollahs hold both religious and political power. I also want you to be aware of three main features on it, in the sense, the religious landscape of Islam. They represent three important cities to their religion, and to some degree very important points in terms of our understanding. In the upper right is the Kaaba, which is at the center of Mecca and is the location that all members of Islam must go to, if at all possible, on their Hajj. In the lower is the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina, the second most holy site, and third in Jerusalem is the Dome of the Rock, which is the third most holy site to Islam. I do want to make a couple notes about things that students often ask in my regular lecture class. And one of them is the question of head coverings for Islamic or Muslim women. Here you see to the far left what's known as the hijab, which is a fairly modern covering that, or scarf that women will wear that exposes the face and simply covers the hair and the head. In the center is the burqa, a much more conservative form worn by traditional women. What you also see is President Ahmadinejad of Iran not wearing a tie. Has nothing to do with Islam. It is more of a turning away from Western culture. The other area that students often ask questions about are some of the modern geopolitical issues within the region. And again, please use your books to focus on these areas, but I want to make a couple of points here in this slide that is worth understanding. And again, the key concepts are present on this slide. Use it as a study guide. But what I want to understand is the idea of Israel in the context of North Africa, Southwest Asia. Israel came into being in 1948. It was a unilateral decision by the Israelis to create their state. This did produce significant tension in the region, and it was an area that had a large Jewish population, but also had significant populations of Palestinians at the time. If you look at these series of maps, examine how the landscape of Israel changes through the time and through the conflicts of the period. That's what I'm going to be looking at in terms of a quiz question. So take some time to look at that. The other point that I do want to make is the question of our presence in Afghanistan. Many students often ask about that. And again, the text is important to understand, is useful to understand much of the traditions coming into this. But what I do want to emphasize is the very, very complex ethnic landscape of Afghanistan. And again, I applaud the work that the forces are doing there. I do want to point out with the next two slides that the cultures and traditions of North Africa and Southwest Asia are becoming very important in the United States. In this slide and in the next slide, you see the relative distributions of Jewish populations in the United States and then of Muslim adherents in the United States. It is worth noting how many people within the United States follow these traditions and how it affects our culture. Okay, to quickly wrap up, this is the end of the slide presentation. Please, in your readings, additionally focus on Iran and Iraq, OPEC, and oil production in the region.